The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, carried by a boy on a mud-splattered pony, who did not wait to be thanked before riding away, as though the paper in his satchel was something better left behind quickly. It came to a small stone cottage on the edge of Faircombe Land, where the mist had not yet lifted from the hedgerows, and where a young woman named Eleanor Hartley stood at the window with a shawl pulled tight against the October chill, watching the world outside as though she already sensed that it was about to change. She did not yet understand what that letter would cost her. She did not yet understand what it would give her either. The seal upon it bore the crest of the House of Ashworth, a wolf's head beneath a crown of thorns, and when Eleanor broke it with fingers that trembled more than she wished them to, the words within were not written with kindness. They rarely were when they came from that house. Before the story carries you further into the fog of that autumn morning, into the halls of a cold estate and the shore of a lake that history had forgotten, allow a moment to ask something small of you. If stories like this one, stories of quiet women who rise against men who underestimate them, of inheritance and secrets buried beneath English soil, if these stories hold some place in your evenings, then consider pressing that subscribe button now so that you do not lose this channel among the thousands of others. And before the tale moves forward, tell us in the comments below where in the world you are watching from tonight. It is a strange and lovely thing to imagine so many corners of the earth listening to the same story of an English lake at the same time. Now, let us return to Eleanor and to the letter that would not let her rest. The cottage in which she stood was not grand. It had not always been so humble a place for a Hartley to live, but grandness, like so many things in Eleanor's life, had been stripped away slowly, the way autumn strips a garden of its colour, not all at once, but leaf by leaf, until one morning you look up and find the branches bare and did not remember the exact day it happened. Her father, Sir Thomas Hartley, had been a gentleman of modest but respectable means, a man who loved horses more than ledgers, and who had, in the final years of his life, allowed both to ruin him in equal measure. When he died, quietly, in his sleep, as though even in death he wished to cause no trouble, he left behind a house heavy with debt. A daughter of 22, with no brothers to inherit in her place, and a name that once spoken with respect in the county, now drew only murmurs of pity behind gloved hands. It was into this fragile world that the letter from Ashworth House arrived. The Duke of Faircombe, Lord Reginald Ashworth, had been her father's creditor in the final desperate years, though creditor was too soft a word for what he had truly become. He held the papers to nearly everything the Hartleys had once owned: the fields, the stable, even the modest cottage in which Eleanor now stood shivering. And now, with her father in his grave scarcely 3 months, the Duke had summoned her to Ashworth House to settle, as the letter coldly phrased it, the matter of remaining obligations. She did not yet understand what he intended by that summons. She would understand within the week, and the understanding would change the whole shape of her life. The carriage that carried her to Ashworth House 3 days later moved slowly along a road lined with ancient oaks, their branches bare and reaching like the fingers of old men warning her to turn back. Eleanor did not turn back. She had learned, in the months since her father's death, that turning back was a luxury reserved for those with somewhere better to go, and she had nowhere better. She had only forward, and forward led, on that grey afternoon, directly into the shadow of the Duke of Faircombe. Ashworth House rose from the mist like something carved rather than built, grey stone towers, ivy climbing the northern wall like a slow green fire, windows dark even at midday, as though the house itself preferred to keep its secrets in darkness. Eleanor had heard whispers of this house all her life. The servants in the village spoke of it the way one speaks of a place from which people did not always return unchanged. She had dismissed such talk as gossip. She would not dismiss it for long. She was received not in a drawing room, as a lady of her former station might once have expected, but in a study lined floor to ceiling with ledgers and legal papers, the fire low, the air smelling of tobacco and old paper and something colder still, the particular scent of a room where kindness rarely entered. The Duke did not rise when she came in. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair silvering faintly at the temples and eyes the colour of a winter sky, pale and unreadable. He was not, she noted with some surprise, an unhandsome man. But there was something in his stillness, in the way he regarded her as one might regard a column of figures, that did not quite balance. That made the room feel colder than the fire could account for. "Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice carried the particular courtesy of a man who has never needed to raise it to be obeyed. "I trust the journey was not too taxing." She said that it was not. He did not waste further time on pleasantries. He informed her, in the flat and businesslike tone of a man reading from a document rather than speaking from a heart, that her father's debts to the House of Ashworth exceeded what little remained of the Hartley estate. The cottage, he said, would be sold. The small parcel of farmland behind it sold as well. What remained of value, and here his mouth curved, not quite into a smile, but into something colder and more deliberate, what remained, he said, was Blackmere Lake. Eleanor did not understand at first why he spoke the name with such open contempt. She would learn soon enough. Blackmere Lake, he explained, had come into Hartley hands 2 generations before, through a marriage settlement long forgotten by everyone but the lawyers who filed such things away in dusty drawers. It was a stretch of water and reeds and crumbling stone at the county's edge, bordered by a shore no one had built upon in living memory. Its old boathouse collapsed. Its water said by the local folk to be unlucky, even cursed, though the Duke did not put stock in such peasant superstition. It produced no income. It attracted no interest. It was, in his own words, delivered with the faint curl of satisfaction at the corner of his mouth. "Take the useless lake, Miss Hartley, and consider your father's debts, and my patience at their end." He said it as though he were doing her a kindness. He said it as though he expected her to weep with gratitude, or perhaps to weep from the sting of the insult. For everyone in the county knew that Blackmere Lake was a place of no consequence, a joke among the landed families, the sort of property one gave away rather than sold, because no one wished to be burdened with its upkeep. What the Duke did not expect, what no one in that cold stone study expected, was the quiet, steady way Eleanor Hartley lifted her chin and said that she would take it. She did not yet understand what remained hidden beneath that lake's black water. Nor did she understand that the Duke's smirk, so careless in that moment, would haunt him before the year was through. She left Ashworth House that afternoon, with nothing but a deed to a worthless lake and a wound to her pride that she did not allow herself to show until the carriage had rounded the first bend in the road, and the towers of Ashworth House had disappeared behind the oaks. Only then did she permit herself the smallest, most private tears, not for the loss of a fortune she had never truly possessed, but for the particular cruelty of a man who had looked at her diminished circumstances and found in them an opportunity for amusement. No one in the county spoke of Blackmere Lake without a certain lowering of the voice, as though the very name invited misfortune to listen. The old boathouse at its edge had stood empty for longer than anyone could precisely recall. Some said 30 years. Others said longer, and a few of the oldest villagers, when pressed, would only shake their heads and change the subject entirely, the way people do when a memory is not wanted. Eleanor arrived there on a morning heavy with fog, in a hired cart loaded with what little remained of her father's possessions, a trunk of clothes, a writing desk, a handful of books, and a small tin box containing letters she had not yet found the courage to read. The lake spread before her like a sheet of dark glass, ringed by reeds gone wild, and willows that trailed their branches into the water as though in mourning. The old boathouse leaned at a mournful angle, its roof half fallen, its door hanging from a single rusted hinge. It was, by any honest measure, a ruin. And yet, Eleanor stood at its edge for a long while, saying nothing. Feeling something she had not expected to feel in that moment of exile, not despair, though despair would have been the reasonable response, but a strange, quiet curiosity. The water was still. The light upon it, even through the fog, held a particular silver quality she had never seen upon any lake before. And somewhere beneath the neglect and the reeds and the fallen boathouse roof, she sensed, though she could not yet have said why, that this place was not so useless as the Duke believed. She did not yet understand how right that instinct would prove to be. The first weeks were the hardest she had known. She took a single room in the gatekeeper's cottage nearby, its roof sound enough to keep out the rain, though little else about it offered comfort. She had almost no money left, only what her father's few remaining possessions had fetched at a quiet sale in the village, and she spent her days clearing the boathouse of debris with her own hands, her gloves worn through by the second week, her palms blistered beneath them. The villagers watched her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. A gentleman's daughter, labouring at the edge of a cursed lake, it was not a sight the county had seen before, and it did not know quite what to make of it. Some brought her bread out of charity. Others crossed to the opposite side of the road when she passed, murmuring that the Hartley girl had lost more than her fortune. She had, perhaps, lost her wits as well. To choose to live at Blackmere, rather than seek a position as governess or companion in some respectable household, as ruined gentlewomen were expected to do. She did not blame them for their whispers. She had, in her darker hours, wondered the same of herself. It was in the third week, while clearing the old boathouse of its fallen timbers, that she found the first of the letters. They were hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the rear wall, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, the paper within yellowed but legible. They were not addressed to her, nor to anyone she recognized by name. The hand that had written them was elegant, feminine, and dated some 60 years before. Signed only with the initial M. What remained hidden in those letters was far more dangerous than Eleanor could have guessed on that first reading. The letters spoke of the lake not as a worthless stretch of water, but as a place once cherished, a place where springs of remarkable clarity fed the lakebed from beneath the earth, waters said in the letters to possess a curative quality. Sought after in an age before Eleanor's grandparents were born, when physicians of a certain fashionable persuasion had sent their patients to take the waters at places precisely like this one. The letters spoke, too, of a dispute, a bitter one, between two families, over the very ground on which Eleanor now stood, and one name recurred through the pages with an insistence that made her breath catch each time she read it. Ashworth. She did not yet understand the full shape of what had happened between the Hartleys and the Ashworths 2 generations before. But she understood, with a certainty that settled cold and clear in her chest, that the Duke's contempt for this useless lake had not been born of ignorance. It had been born of something far more deliberate. She said nothing of the letters to anyone. Not yet. She folded them carefully back into their oilcloth and hid them beneath her mattress, and she began, in the quiet hours before dawn, to search the boathouse and the old gatekeeper's cottage for anything more the years might have buried. She did not have to search long before the mysteries began to multiply. There was, first, the matter of the gardener. An old man named Silas Wren had tended the grounds of the Lake estate decades before, when it had still belonged to whichever family held it in those forgotten years, and he lived still in a cottage half a mile distant, though age and long solitude had made him a figure the village children whispered about rather than approached. Eleanor sought him out in her 4th week at the lake, hoping he might know something of its history, and found a man whose eyes sharpened with sudden and unmistakable alarm the moment she spoke the name Blackmere. He would not speak of it at length. He would only say, in a voice roughened by age and something that sounded very much like fear, that some things buried by water were better left there, and that she ought to have taken the debt over the lake, whatever her pride had told her. She did not yet understand why an old gardener would fear a lake more than poverty. She would understand, in time, and the understanding would frighten her far more than his warning had. There was, second, the matter of the boathouse floor. Beneath the boards where she had found the letters, there was a second layer, older still, and beneath that, when at last curiosity overcame her caution and she pried away the rotted wood with a borrowed crowbar, a small iron box, rusted nearly shut, containing not letters this time, but a single miniature portrait, painted in the delicate style of some 60 years past, of a young woman with fair hair and eyes so pale a blue, they seemed almost silver eyes, Eleanor could not help but notice, disturbingly similar to her own. She did not yet understand who this woman had been. But something in her chest told her that the answer, when it came, would rewrite everything she believed about her family, and about the lake, and perhaps even about herself. There was, third, and most troubling of all, the matter of the visitor who came at night. It was in her 6th week at Blackmere that Eleanor first noticed the light. A small, moving glow, far across the water, near the ruined northern shore, appearing only after midnight and vanishing before dawn. She told herself, in the beginning, that it was nothing more than a will-o'-the-wisp, the marsh gas the old villagers spoke of with such dread. But will-o'-the-wisps did not, to her knowledge, cast shadows shaped like a man, nor did they retreat, as this light did on the 3rd night she watched it, the moment she stepped from her cottage door with a lantern of her own. Someone else was coming to Blackmere Lake in the dark, and whoever it was did not wish to be seen. No one in the county spoke of it, not even Silas Wren, who grew pale and silent whenever she pressed him upon the subject, and whose warnings grew only more insistent. Leave the lake, Miss Hartley, before the water asks more of you than you are willing to give. She did not leave. She was, whatever else circumstance had taken from her, still a Hartley, and Hartleys, whatever their misfortunes, did not run from mysteries. They solved them. It was into this uneasy quiet, the letters hidden beneath her mattress, the portrait with its uncanny silver eyes locked in the drawer of her writing desk, the mysterious light flickering across the water in the depths of night, that the Duke's nephew arrived at Blackmere, uninvited and unannounced. Some 7 weeks after Eleanor first took possession of her worthless inheritance. His name was Mr. Julian Ashworth Price, a cousin's son who stood to inherit a considerable fortune should certain conditions of an old family will be met, and he arrived at the lake's edge on a fine bay horse, dressed in the manner of a man who wished the world to know precisely how little he thought of it, and how much of it he expected, none the less, to belong to him eventually. He was, Eleanor noted within the first quarter hour of his visit, nothing like his uncle. Where the Duke's coldness held a certain terrible dignity, Julian's held only a careless, grasping hunger, poorly disguised beneath a smile too easily given. He had come, he said, out of nothing more than neighbourly concern, to see how the poor Hartley girl fared in her exile at the useless lake. But his eyes, as he spoke, moved not to Eleanor's face, but past her, to the boathouse, to the northern shore, to the water itself, with a keenness that had nothing whatsoever to do with neighbourly concern. She did not yet understand what Julian Ashworth Price wanted with a worthless lake. She would understand before the season turned, and the understanding would very nearly cost her everything she had begun, in those quiet weeks, to build. Winter descended upon Blackmere Lake with a hush that seemed, to Eleanor, almost reverent, as though the land itself were holding its breath in anticipation of what the spring would bring. She spent the cold months, not in idleness, but in study, for among her father's few remaining books she had found, quite by chance, an old volume on the mineral properties of natural springs, and armed with this and the crumbling letters signed only with the initial M, she began, in the candlelit evenings of that long winter. To piece together a history the county had spent 60 years trying to forget. The letters, once she had gathered the courage to read them in full, told a story of two families bound not merely by land, but by love and betrayal in equal, aching measure. The woman who signed herself M, Eleanor came at last to understand, had been named Margaret Wren, daughter of the very gardener whose warnings had so unsettled her. Though in Margaret's own youth, the Wrens had held a position rather higher than gardener. Margaret's mother, the letters revealed, had been a Hartley by birth, and her father, here the story darkened considerably, had once held a claim to the lake and its curative springs that the Ashworth family of that generation had been most determined to erase. There had been, the letters made clear, a courtship between Margaret Wren and a young Ashworth heir, the Duke's own grandfather. As Eleanor calculated the years, with a chill creeping slowly up her spine, a courtship that had ended, not in marriage, but in disgrace, when the elder Ashworths discovered that the springs beneath Blackmere Lake held a value they had no wish to share with a family so far beneath their own consequence. What followed, the letters described in language grown increasingly desperate across their final pages, was a campaign of quiet ruin. Rumours spread through the county that the lake's water carried disease rather than healing. Physicians who had once recommended it to their patients were paid, or threatened, into silence. The springs were deliberately allowed to silt and stagnate, the boathouse left to rot, until Blackmere Lake, once the pride of the county's healing waters, became instead a place of superstition and dread, its true nature buried as thoroughly as the woman who had loved and lost an Ashworth heir, and who had, in the final letter Eleanor unfolded with trembling hands, written words that struck her like a blow. My daughter does not know the truth of her birth, and I pray she never learns it, for the shame the Ashworths have manufactured around this water is now so complete that even the innocent among us cannot escape its stain. If ever a Hartley should come to hold this lake again, let her know that its waters were never cursed. They were only ever coveted and denied to those the Ashworths deemed unworthy of their gift. She did not yet understand, in that candlelit hour, precisely how the threads of her own bloodline wove into Margaret Wren's forgotten sorrow. But the miniature portrait in her writing desk drawer, the pale, silver-eyed young woman who so resembled her own reflection, no longer seemed so mysterious, and the old gardener's fear, each time she spoke the lake's name, no longer seemed so strange. Silas Wren, she now suspected with a certainty that made her hands tremble as she set down the final letter, was not merely an old servant with memories of a vanished employer. He might very well be her own great-uncle. She confronted him with this suspicion on a morning when frost lay thick upon the reeds, and the old man, after a long and searching silence, did not deny it. He wept, in fact, an old man's tears, slow and unashamed, and told her at last the fuller truth the letters had only hinted at, that Margaret Wren had been his elder sister, driven from the county in disgrace after her ruined courtship, that she had married a Hartley cousin in quiet exile and borne a daughter who never knew her mother's history, and that this daughter, in turn, had been Eleanor's own grandmother. The Duke's family had not merely inherited an old dispute over a worthless lake. They had built their contempt for it upon the deliberate ruin of Eleanor's own ancestors. And the shame they had manufactured to conceal a truth that would have cost them dearly had it ever come to light, that the springs of Blackmere Lake were valuable beyond anything the county's gossip had ever imagined, and that the right to them had been stolen, not inherited. She did not yet understand how she would prove such a claim, decades removed and buried beneath so many careful lies. But she understood, with a clarity that steadied rather than frightened her, precisely what she intended to do with the lake the Duke had so carelessly discarded. She would restore it, not merely as a private vindication, though vindication was sweet enough to consider, but as something the whole county could witness, proof, standing in stone and water and healing spring, that the Hartleys and the Wrens before them had never been the ruined, unlucky family the Ashworths had spent 60 years convincing the world they were. It was no small undertaking for a woman with almost no money and a single loyal old man for company, and the obstacles that met her in the months that followed tested a resolve she had not fully known she possessed. The northern shore, where the mysterious nightlight had appeared, revealed its secret in early spring, when Eleanor, no longer willing to wait passively for explanation, followed the flickering glow across the frost-hardened ground and found, crouched at the water's edge with a lantern and a set of surveyor's instruments, none other than Julian Ashworth Price. He did not deny his purpose when confronted, for denial, he seemed to calculate in that moment, would serve him less than a certain oily candour. He had learned, through channels he declined to specify, though Eleanor suspected an indiscreet clerk in his uncle's employ, of old surveys suggesting mineral value beneath the lake's silted springs. He had come, in the deep of night across many weeks, to confirm these surveys for himself, intending, once satisfied, to petition his uncle to reclaim the worthless gift on some legal pretext, before Eleanor could discover its worth and claim it fully as her own. He offered her, with the smile of a man who believed every woman had her price, a modest sum to quietly relinquish the deed before matters grew complicated. She refused him with a composure that seemed to unsettle him rather more than fury would have done, and he rode away from Blackmere that night with a warning of his own that she would find the coming months considerably less peaceful than the ones behind her. He was not wrong. What remained hidden was far more dangerous than a mere property dispute, and Julian's discovery of her ambitions set in motion a chain of quiet sabotage that tested every ounce of patience Eleanor possessed. Workmen she hired to help clear and rebuild the boathouse found themselves mysteriously offered better wages elsewhere and vanished within the week. A shipment of stone for the new bathing house foundations was delayed at the county road by an obstruction no one could quite explain. Rumours, old and familiar, of the lake's ill luck resurfaced in the village with a freshness that suggested deliberate encouragement rather than idle memory. Through it all, Eleanor did not retreat. She wrote, with Silas Wren's shaking but determined assistance, to a physician of some reputation in the county town, enclosing a sample of the spring water drawn fresh from beneath the silt she had painstakingly cleared with her own hands through the bitter early months of the year. She waited, through weeks that felt longer than the whole of the winter before them, for his reply. While she waited, the village itself began, slowly and almost against its own will, to change its opinion of her. It began with small things. A farmer's wife, who had once crossed the road to avoid her, now paused to ask, with genuine curiosity rather than pity, how the work at the lake progressed. A young boy who had once dared his friends to run past the cursed shore after dark, now lingered at its edge in daylight, watching the new stonework rise with open fascination rather than fear. Eleanor understood that she was not merely rebuilding a boathouse and a garden. She was, patiently and without quite intending it, rebuilding the story the county told itself about a name and a family that had been dismissed for 60 years. Not everyone softened so easily. There remained among the older families a faction who muttered still of ill luck and unwise ambition, who predicted with the particular relish some people reserve for another's failure that the Hartley girls' foolish scheme would collapse before the first frost, that no physician of consequence would ever lend his name to water so long associated with misfortune, and that she would, before the year was out, be forced to sell what remained of the ruined property for whatever pittance the Duke's family cared to offer. Eleanor heard these predictions second-hand, carried to her by the sympathetic farmer's wife or by Silas Wren, who by now had appointed himself something between a grandfather and a guardian to her, fierce in his indignation on her behalf. She let the predictions pass unanswered. She had learned, in the month since the letter arrived on that Tuesday morning, that answers spoken in anger convinced no one, while results, quietly and steadily achieved, eventually convinced everyone. And so she continued her work through the lengthening days of early spring, clearing the last of the silted channels that fed the springs, restoring the stone paths that had once, in Margaret Wren's day, led fashionable visitors down to waters they had been taught, so cruelly and so deliberately, to fear. When it came, the physician's letter confirmed every hope the old correspondence had planted in her heart. The waters of Blackmere Lake, the physician wrote with evident and growing enthusiasm, possessed mineral properties of genuine and unusual value, properties he had encountered, in his long career, at only a handful of the most celebrated healing springs in the kingdom. He would, he assured her, be glad to lend his name and reputation to any establishment built upon such a discovery, and he suspected several of his fashionable patients would be glad of a nearer alternative to the crowded, overpriced spa towns currently in vogue. Before this story carries you into what came next, into the true confrontation between Eleanor and the Duke, and the truth that would finally surface after 60 years beneath still water, take just one more moment. If you have followed Eleanor this far into the fog and frost of her long winter, the kindest thing you might do is press that subscribe button now, so you are here when the next chapter of a story like this one begins. And do share in the comments whether you sensed the truth of the lake before Eleanor herself uncovered it. Some of you, I suspect, already have your suspicions about a certain Duke. Armed now with proof, rather than mere family memory, Eleanor understood that the moment had come to face the House of Ashworth directly, not as the diminished, grateful girl who had once accepted a worthless gift with lowered eyes, but as a woman who held at last the truth in her own two hands. She did not send a letter this time. She rode to Ashworth House herself, on a morning in early summer when the oaks along the drive had come fully into leaf, green and defiant against the grey stone towers ahead, and she was received, once again, in the same cold study where the Duke had first delivered his careless insult nearly a year before. He looked, she noted, faintly surprised to see her, and more surprised still by the composed, unhurried manner in which she seated herself across from him without waiting to be invited, and drew from her satchel first the physician's letter, then the 60-year-old correspondence of Margaret Wren, and finally the small miniature portrait whose silver eyes so plainly echoed her own. She did not raise her voice as she laid out, piece by careful piece, the history his own family had spent 2 generations concealing, the courtship denied, the reputation deliberately ruined, the springs deliberately silted and forgotten, the curse invented and nurtured through decades of quiet, deniable cruelty. All so that an Ashworth grandfather's inconvenient love and its inconvenient consequences might vanish beneath gossip and neglect. The Duke's face, through the whole of this recitation, betrayed remarkably little. But his stillness, Eleanor had learned by now, was not the stillness of a man untouched. It was the stillness of a man who had built his entire composure upon never allowing the world to see the moment it finally struck him. When at last she finished, the silence in the study stretched long enough that the fire's low crackle seemed almost thunderous by comparison. It was the Duke, finally, who broke it, and what he said was not the denial Eleanor had half expected, nor the practiced dismissal of a man who had spent his life certain of his own family's rightness. He asked, instead, in a voice stripped for the first time of its habitual coldness, whether she had brought the letters so that he might read Margaret Wren's words for himself. She had not anticipated that request. She granted it nonetheless. He read in silence for a long while, the pages trembling faintly in hands that had never, in Eleanor's admittedly brief acquaintance with him, shown the smallest tremor before. And when he set the last letter down, he told her, haltingly, as a man unaccustomed to confession finds his way slowly through unfamiliar territory, that he had grown up hearing only fragments of this history, that his own father had spoken of Blackmere Lake with a contempt he had never questioned nor understood, and that he had, in offering it to her with such careless cruelty a year before, been repeating a family habit of dismissal, without once wondering what that dismissal had truly cost. He did not ask her forgiveness outright. Pride, even now, would not quite permit it. But he offered something Eleanor had not anticipated, and had certainly not come seeking: his family's resources, and more surprising still, his own personal assistance in restoring what his ancestors had so deliberately destroyed. She did not accept immediately. Trust, once so thoroughly betrayed by a family's long history of quiet cruelty, could not be rebuilt in a single afternoon's confession, however sincere it appeared. But she did not refuse outright either, and in the weeks that followed, a curious and cautious alliance began to take shape between the Duke of Faircombe and the woman he had once mocked with a gift of worthless water. The truth, once surfaced, could not be buried again so easily as it had been the first time. Julian Ashworth Price, learning of his uncle's change of heart, made one final, desperate attempt to salvage his own ambitions. Arriving at Blackmere under cover of darkness, with 2 hired men and a set of forged documents intended to establish a prior claim to the mineral rights beneath the lake, documents he hoped to file before Eleanor's restoration could be formally completed. But Silas Wren, whose eyes and ears remained sharper than his nephew, for so Julian too, proved distantly connected to the old Wren line. Through a tangled branch Eleanor had not yet fully untangled, caught wind of the scheme in time to alert both Eleanor and, in a final test of the fragile new trust between them, the Duke himself. It was the Duke who rode to Blackmere that night, arriving not many minutes behind his nephew's hired men, and it was the Duke's authority, backed by the weight of his name and title, that sent Julian's scheme collapsing before it could do any lasting harm. Julian Ashworth Price left the county before the month was out, his ambitions and his forged documents alike exposed to a disgrace considerably more thorough than any he had ever attempted to visit upon Eleanor. With that final threat extinguished, the restoration of Blackmere Lake proceeded through the remainder of that summer and into the autumn with a momentum that surprised even Eleanor, who had spent so long expecting each new step forward to be met with some fresh obstacle. The old boathouse was rebuilt, its timbers sound, its roof whole once more. A proper bathing house rose upon the northern shore, built of pale stone that caught the light in a manner the physician who had first confirmed the spring's virtues declared thoroughly worthy of the water it was built to serve. Gardens, long overgrown, were coaxed back into ordered beauty, their paths winding down to a shore no longer choked with reeds, but opened, at last, to the silver water beneath. By the time the first fashionable visitors arrived from the county town the following spring, drawn by the physician's glowing recommendations, and by a curiosity that Eleanor's own quiet, unshakable dignity throughout the past year had done much to cultivate, Blackmere Lake bore almost no resemblance to the ruin she had first stood before, with nothing but a hired cart and a tin box of unread letters. She did not yet understand, in those early days of the resort's opening, quite how thoroughly her fortunes had turned. She would understand it fully only some months later, when the county's most fashionable families began to speak of Blackmere not with the old lowered voice of superstition, but with the eager, admiring tone reserved for the finest new establishment the region had seen in a generation. The Duke of Faircombe visited often that first season, and if the county noticed how much more frequently his visits fell than strict business required, and how much less coldly he spoke, in company, of the young woman who had built a resort from a lake he had once so carelessly discarded, they were, for the most part, too well-mannered to remark upon it directly, though it did not stop them from remarking upon it at length in private. What passed between Eleanor and the Duke in the months that followed was not the swift, dramatic reconciliation of a storybook romance, for both had been too thoroughly wounded, she by his family's long cruelty, and he, by the slow unravelling of every certainty he had once held about his own name. To embrace such easy sentiment, it was, instead, a slower thing. An unexpected friendship built first upon shared work, upon long afternoons spent reviewing the resort's accounts or walking its new gardens discussing improvements, and only gradually, as trust accumulated in small and careful increments, upon something warmer still. She never forgot what he had once been, nor entirely forgave, in the deepest private chambers of her heart, the family cruelty that had cost her ancestors their reputation and their peace for 60 long years. But she came, in time, to see the man before her as someone genuinely attempting to be different from the grandfather whose careless words had set this whole quiet tragedy into motion. And that attempt, honestly and consistently made, earned from her, if not forgetfulness, then something perhaps more valuable, a measured, hard-won respect. By the following autumn, Blackmere Lake had become, by the unanimous and rather astonished agreement of the county's oldest families, the finest resort within a day's travel of London, its healing waters celebrated in the very physicians' circles that had once dismissed it. Its gardens praised in the same drawing rooms where, not 2 years before, Eleanor Hartley's misfortunes had been discussed only in tones of careful, distant pity. She stood, on the evening of the resort's grand autumn gathering, at the edge of the northern shore where Julian Ashworth Price had once crouched in secret with his surveyor's instruments, and watched the lantern light, proper lantern light now, warm and welcoming rather than furtive, dance across water that had waited 60 years to be seen clearly again. Silas Wren, considerably steadier now in health and spirit than the frightened old man who had first warned her away from this shore, stood not far off, his eyes bright with an emotion he no longer troubled to hide. The Duke found her there, as the last light of the autumn sun slipped below the western hills, and though the story does not record every word that passed between them in that particular quiet hour, it records enough to know that whatever words were spoken, they were spoken gently, and that Eleanor, for the first time since the letter had arrived on that Tuesday morning, so many months before, felt something in her chest that was not grief, nor determination, nor even the fierce, protective pride that had carried her through the long winter of restoration. She felt, quite simply, at peace, a peace that had been a year and more in the making, built not from ease, but from labour, not from inheritance, but from proof, and not from anyone's charity, but from her own two blistered, patient hands. She thought, in that quiet hour, of the woman on the road that grey afternoon so long ago, weeping alone in a hired carriage over a gift given in scorn, and she found she could no longer summon that woman's despair, however clearly she remembered it. So much had grown, since that day, from ground everyone else had called worthless. So much had been uncovered that everyone else had believed forever buried. And she understood, watching the lantern light move gently across water that had waited 60 patient years to be seen again, that the truest inheritance she had ever received was not land, nor title, nor even the vindication she had so long and so quietly sought. It was simply this: the knowledge that she had never once, through the hardest months of her life, mistaken another's contempt for the measure of her own worth. The lake that the Duke of Faircombe had once offered with a smirk, believing it the least valuable thing he possessed, had become, in the patient and unyielding hands of the woman he had so carelessly underestimated, the finest jewel the county had to offer. And, more than that, it had become the instrument through which 60 years of buried shame was finally, gently, laid to rest. Margaret Wren's final letter, the one Eleanor had read so many times through that long candlelit winter that its creases had softened from the handling, was framed at last and hung within the new bathing house, not hidden this time, but honoured, a quiet testament for any visitor curious enough to read it, that the waters they had come so far to enjoy had once been denied to those who loved them most, and had waited, patiently as still water always waits for someone brave enough to uncover what had been buried. Eleanor Hartley never again heard her family's name spoken with pity in the drawing rooms of the county. She heard it, instead, spoken with a respect that no inheritance, however grand, could have purchased so honestly, earned instead through patience, through quiet, unyielding intelligence, and through a refusal to accept that a gift given in scorn must remain, forever, exactly as scornful as the hand that gave it. And, on quiet evenings, long after the resort's fashionable seasons had become an accepted and celebrated part of county life, visitors walking the shore of Blackmere Lake would sometimes pause beside the framed letter in the bathing house and read the words of a woman named Margaret, who had never lived to see her hope fulfilled, and they would look out over water so clear and so calm that it seemed, in the particular slant of an autumn evening's light, almost to hold a memory of its own, the memory of a story preserved in the quiet, patient keeping of an old English lake, waiting, as such stories always do, for someone willing enough to listen.